Hey, well, welcome back. I think everybody can hear me. I hope so. Uh, we're ready to start our keynote session, and as before, we have our deaf interpreters with us today to help with facilitate our meeting. And so, welcome back. My name is Steve Ortego, and I am chair of ADPAC. And for those of you who are students or may not understand, ADPAC is the committee that's responsible for the money side of our advocacy efforts in DC and around the country. Our board is composed of wonderful, gregarious folks with absolutely no modesty when it comes to asking for money. And our job as a PAC is to raise money. We then use that to develop relationships and offer re-election support to our friends in Congress. And we also use events like Lobby Day to educate all our member dentists and our members of Congress on the issues that are important to dentistry and the tremendous value and benefit and necessity of our political involvement. So please, here we go with the ask. So please visit the ADPAC booth, quote unquote. In the old days when we met in person, we actually had a booth and you could go there and make your contribution there. But for today and going forward until we can maybe get to Vegas, when we can all meet together, but you can go to ada.org/ADA.org/ADPAC and follow the prompts and make your contribution there. So thank you. And so now we're ready to get started with our keynote session. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce to you two accomplished journalists who are with us from the 19th. Now, the 19th is a nonprofit independent news organization based in Austin, Texas. It was founded in 2020 by CEO Emily Ramshaw and publisher Amanda Zamora, both former Texas Tribune staffers who served as editor-in-chief and chief audience officer, respectively. The organization is named after the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which gave women the right to vote, reflecting its mission, quote, to empower women, particularly those underserved by and underrepresented in American media, with the information, community, and tools they need to be equal participants in our democracy, in quotes. So with us this afternoon are Amanda Becker and Erin Haynes. Amanda Becker is the Washington correspondent for the 19th. She has covered the U.S. Congress and the White House and elections for more than a decade. Becker previously worked at Reuters and CQ Roll Call. Her work has appeared in publications including The Washington Post, The New Republic, and Glamour magazine. Her political coverage has also been broadcast on NPR radio. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you.
Also with us today is Erin Haynes, editor-at-large of the 19th, an award-winning journalist with nearly 2 decades of experience. Erin was previously national writer on race for the Associated Press. She's also worked at the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post. Welcome, Erin. So these two ladies are going to give you an insider perspective on what is currently happening in Washington. And then we'll be glad to take some questions at the end. And so you can type those into the Q&A as you've been doing all afternoon on the right side of your screen. So ladies, I'll turn it right over to you. Go right ahead.
Erin, do you want to kick it off since you are a founding member of the 19th and let us know a little bit more about the organization before we delve into what's happening on Capitol Hill and at the White House?
Sure, Amanda, and I am happy to be sharing a screen with you. I wish that we were doing it in person, obviously. Same to you, Dr. Ortego, and with all of our wonderful audience members. Thank you so much for inviting us to share a little bit of your Sunday afternoon and part of this conference with you all. A very important conversation to be having today, and we're glad to be a part of it. So, as Dr. Ortego said, the 19th was founded in January of 2020, a week before the Iowa caucuses is when we officially kind of soft launched this endeavor. And really, it was aimed at trying to change the conversation around gender and politics in this country. We know that women are the majority of the U.S. population and the majority of the U.S. electorate, but too often, political journalism treats women as a special interest group as opposed to, like I said, the half the population in this country and the majority of voters. And so we wanted to change that. We believe at the 19th that all issues are women's issues, but also just that we needed to be able to talk about our politics differently as it pertained to women and marginalized people in this country. As Dr. Ortega said, our newsroom is named for the 19th Amendment. But if you've ever seen our website, if you've ever seen our logo, there's an asterisk at the end of the 19th, and that asterisk is in recognition of the Black women who were omitted from their access to the franchise when the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. And the reason that happened was because the white women frankly believed that they should have been prioritized in their access to the ballot box at that time. And so Native American women, Latinas, Asian American women would have to fight for nearly another half century for their full access to the ballot. And that is frankly access that remains fragile even to this day. The right to vote is certainly something that is being debated in many state houses across the country, even as we speak. And so has been something that those groups have had to be vigilant about defending for generations since the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But at the 19th, we were very focused last year, obviously, on covering the 2020 election, which was already going to be the most consequential in our lifetimes. A lot of us felt, but that became even more true for us during a pandemic that had a disproportionate impact on women, on people of color in this country. And so that was certainly a huge focus of our coverage and reporting last year, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But this year, as we turn to 2021, new administration is taking shape. We're certainly covering that. This conversation comes at a very timely point as we are marking literally this week the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration. And so really looking at what it means for who we elect to govern in this country, what that leadership looks like, and how those people's lived experiences are really translating into policy are among the themes that we are watching at the 19th and that we have been covering. Amanda, certainly foremost among our reporters doing that work.
Yeah, so I guess we can start off talking a little bit about what the administration priorities are and then kind of what the forecast looks like for some of those in Congress. And I don't know if you want to tell us, Aaron, I mean, obviously the very first thing that President Biden did was kind of get through a new coronavirus relief package. They did that in a way that they did not need to pick up much Republican support on Capitol Hill. Because their argument was we need to get this done fast. We don't have enough time to go through all the steps that we would normally. This is already delayed. But kind of looking forward, what do you see kind of in the next few weeks and next few months? We're hitting this marker. What's next for President Biden? You're talking to them every day.
Yeah, well, I mean, listen, I think it was clear from the moment that President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris were elected that the pandemic was going to be priority number one, confronting this coronavirus from both a public health and an economic perspective, because the American people were looking for, what the national response was going to be to the pandemic. That we, needed to stand up a vaccine rollout plan fairly quickly, but also, to get economic relief to a lot of folks who, were either underemployed or unemployed, and really were just trying to navigate their new normal in this pandemic. And so that happened with the American Rescue Plan, in the form of stimulus payments, in the form of that more nationalized vaccine rollout, where we now have, upwards of half of all adults having gotten at least their first dose of a coronavirus vaccine, right? So, with that having happened, the administration is now focused on getting their infrastructure plan passed. This week, they're going to be rolling out their jobs plan for to try to get the economy even more back on track, but really kind of also reimagining infrastructure as not just being about roads and bridges, but also things like, the country's water system, caregiving, people as part of the infrastructure conversation is something that the president is framing as kind of the evolution of what we think about when we think about infrastructure in this country, but also issues that include voting rights, because we saw what happened in the 2020 election with the former president kind of talking about the election being rigged, the results being fraudulent, which we know is not true. I mean, Joe Biden is the duly elected president of the United States, but Democrats certainly wanting to address voter protection, while Republicans are stressing the need for election integrity, despite the fact that, this election was declared the most secure in the history of our country. So that is a fight that is certainly we're seeing happening up on the Hill, even as the new administration is kind of stressing the need to do something around strengthening voting rights in America. And also, with the, kind of ongoing national reckoning around race and policing in this country, trying to see what, if anything, is going to happen in terms of reforms to policing in America. Certainly, Democrats are trying to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act in the wake of the Derek Chauvin trial. He just being convicted last week in George Floyd's murder, hoping to build on that momentum. But it's unclear, whether or what Republicans would be willing to agree to pass that legislation in an evenly divided and hyper-partisan Senate. So, it is certainly a very interesting time in the administration. The administration is, polling shows that they have high marks on things like the coronavirus and the economy and just kind of overall. But certainly the bipartisanship that President Biden had kind of hoped for when he took office is not something that's necessarily coming together, at least in Washington. And, the country still has a lot of unifying and healing to do before we are moving forward, together as citizens. So it's been really interesting to see that playing out in these first 100 days.
Yeah, and just to build off that a little bit, since I spend most of my time talking to lawmakers on Capitol Hill, as I mentioned earlier, that first relief package was done basically with only Democratic support. It kind of stalled a larger conversation that's happening in Washington about the filibuster, which essentially requires most legislation to get 60 votes in the Senate to pass. Now, the Senate is evenly split right now. Vice President Kamala Harris can act as a tiebreaker, but that is only for nominations, whether it's to departments and agencies or the courts. And it's only for pieces of legislation that they can pass using a process called reconciliation. Now, that can't be used for everything. They used that for the coronavirus relief. They're aiming to use that for infrastructure as well. So we're going to have to see kind of what happens with that fight. It's a fight over procedure in the Senate, but it could have potentially massive ramifications in terms of how it does or does not enable President Biden to get his agenda through in the first couple of years of his presidency. Democrats do not have the support to change that filibuster right now. That could change. I'm not sure it would change for infrastructure because they plan on doing that with reconciliation, so they won't need those 60 votes. And there's a lot of lawmakers lamenting on the Hill right now. Republicans are saying they do think that potentially some Republicans could come on board to an infrastructure package if it went through the regular committee process, if they haggled a little bit. It might not be what either side wants exactly, but at least they could come together, and they think that would send a message to the American people that they are willing to start working together again. But, that process is kind of in its infancy in terms of the stage. And the other fights looming, in addition to infrastructure, are this voting rights bill. There's actually two of them in Congress right now. There's one that's a lot more broad, the For the People Act. I would describe that more as a good governance bill that has voting pieces to it. And then there's a narrower bill named after John Lewis that's more specifically related to voting rights. Now, if we were going to talk about a topic where I think some reluctant Democrats might actually have a renewed interest in discussing filibuster reform, I am told that it would be that voting rights bill and the voting piece of this that might actually sway a couple Democrats in the Senate, because right now there aren't enough Democrats in the Senate to change that process. So, infrastructure, they're still at such a beginning stage on that they're still, not even on the same page in terms of what infrastructure actually is and what it includes. So we're at the very, very beginning of those two processes, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, Amanda, I want to pick up on some of what you're saying there and ask you kind of what you see in terms of how the new Congress is taking shape in the first 100 days. And also if you think, to the extent that there are any areas where there may be consensus for this hyper-partisan Congress.
Evenly split, it's a lot more fraught. The process is going to have to look a lot different. There are, people who wish that things had been able to start off in a more bipartisan manner on that coronavirus relief package to kind of get the ball rolling with kind of what President Biden talked about during the campaign. Of course, that didn't happen. They wanted to get it done really quickly. There's a lot of senators lamenting that they would like to return to what they call regular order, which is having everything start in their committees and kind of starting at square one and hashing things out with, between one another. They think that not only has the administration gotten too involved, a lot of them believe that the congressional leaders have gotten too involved, and that legislation should not be written, by the Senate Majority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader. They should be written in their committees because that's how the process was set up to work. So I do think there are some narrow things that they could come together on. We saw last week, we had a nearly unanimous vote in the Senate for a bill, kind of responding to the rise in hate crimes and hate incidents against Asian American individuals during this pandemic. That started out as a partisan bill, and the vote ended up being 94-1. So, I think that I spoke to Senator Susan Collins, a Republican from Maine, after that vote, because she had reached out to Democrat Mazie Hirono from Hawaii to really kind of hammer out some language that Senator Collins thought might make that bill more appealing to some of the Republicans. So, at the end of our conversation, she told me maybe there's hope for the Senate yet. We'll have to wait and see, but that was kind of a good sentiment to end on with her that day. And we're just going to have to see. There are two different policing bills right now that they're talking about. One Democrat, one Republican. They have a couple things in common, but not a ton. And this infrastructure, I do think will be a battle, even if they decide to do it with only Democratic votes.
Yeah, well, listen, hope springs eternal in Congress, even in the divided Senate. But I also want to ask you, we talk about those divisions between parties, but the intra-party divisions are also starting to emerge, and that's something that you've also written a lot about. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about those dynamics and how you see them playing out in terms of what can get done, especially in the Senate.
Yeah, so I'll start with the House and then move on to the Senate. In the House, Speaker Pelosi runs a pretty tight ship. She's not going to have many problems that I foresee getting things through the House this Congress. That could change if their margin shifts a little bit in the midterms, but for right now, the side that is more fractious in the House is the Republican conference. They are dealing with kind of their identity post-Trump. They have a couple new lawmakers who have been kind of controversial these first couple months on the Hill. They had a situation where, they had to have another impeachment vote and decide how they were going to cast their votes on that in January. And you saw actually them try to push out the only woman in Republican leadership, Representative Cheney, over that vote. She survived, and she's still around, and she's still in leadership, and actually just raised a lot of money for her reelection bid, a historic amount of money. So, on the Republicans are the ones I watch on the House side, just to get an idea of kind of the direction that party's going and where we might see them move in the midterms. On the Senate side, Chuck Schumer is in a very different situation than Nancy Pelosi. He doesn't have the numbers to do almost anything. So not only does he need to pick up Republicans to get most anything done, he has a few members of his own party that are swing votes, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona. And they are kind of the senators to be watched right now, because either one of those two could derail even an infrastructure package that they were trying to pass just with Democratic votes. So they cannot afford to lose even a single vote in the Senate And that's best case scenario if they're, pursuing this narrow reconciliation path that they can use a simple majority.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Ortego, did you have any questions for us?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I did have a couple that I wanted to ask you about. The Republicans seem to have had some success in recruiting women into their caucus. And so I was curious about what you thought the changes that might bring.
Yeah, so Republicans this past election, so really it was kind of a rebound. We had seen the number of Republican women in the House really dwindle, and they watched in 2018 as there was this massive flux of Democratic women. And just to give you an idea of where we're at right now, women currently make up about 27% of the House. There are 87 Democrats and 31 Republicans. And I'm looking at a sheet of paper because this changes pretty much every week because there's still some special elections happening to fill seats of people who went into the administration and that sort of thing. So, we saw this rebound of women coming into the House this past year on the Republican side. And that's in large part because there were several people who watched in 2018 and said, raise the alarm bell. This is not good for the party. We need to be winning more of these races. The issue with women candidates a couple of years ago is that they weren't able to get through their primaries. So you saw a couple lawmakers, House lawmakers, start recruiting using the party apparatus more to support women candidates and get them up onto the, to the general election. You also saw lawmakers like Elise Stefanik up in New York start a PAC specifically to support women candidates in their early stages. And, I think one thing that we've noticed with these women candidates is this past year, there were a lot of House races where women were competing in some of the most competitive districts in the country, and they were winning on both sides. You saw Victoria Spartz in a district that includes most of Indianapolis. Susan Brooks was retiring. Susan Brooks was actually one of the ones who sounded the alarm, and she was in charge of recruitment for the House and said, we need to get more women in here. I think Democrats thought they were going to pick up that seat, actually, when Susan Brooks announced she was going to be retiring. It was seen as this bellwether seat in the suburbs of middle America, kind of like a hint at kind of where things would go that year. And Victoria Spartz won, and she was one of the incoming women this year. So, in terms of how they govern, I don't think that having women don't all govern one way. I mean, you can see this even just within the Republican Party. You have newcomers like Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia and Lauren Boebert from Colorado, who are kind of on one side of the spectrum. You have a person like Nancy Mace from South Carolina, who's a lot more moderate. So, it'll be really interesting to kind of see the variety of roles that women start to fill kind of in their party leadership and in their party structures as their numbers increase to the extent on the Republican side, like we've seen on the Democratic side. And we may have lost Dr. Ortega.
Right. I think you and I can keep it going. Oh, wait, maybe he's coming back here.
Amanda and Aaron, hi.
Yeah.
We are trying to get Dr. Ortego back on.
There he is. There you are. Oh, wait.
For a second.
Oh, yeah. There you are.
We can hear you now, Doctor.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. I did have one other question, pardon me, about our freshman class for this Congress. What do you think about the freshman class and what impact they might have?
Well, you may have been off screen. I was talking about a few of the freshmen on the Republican side. I had mentioned Lauren Boebert in Colorado, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who I'm sure everyone has heard about. So, and then you have people like Representative Nancy Mace from South Carolina. And so, this freshman class kind of really runs the gamut, not only across the parties, but within the parties. And it will be really interesting, I think, to see them, especially on the Republican side. I think that this freshman class has the potential to really impact kind of the direction of the party and how it's headed and how they're going to grapple with what it means to be a Republican kind of in the post-Trump world and how much of an influence he stays on that party. Because, he's already talking about running again in 2024. And I honestly think the midterms could be a signal of kind of the likelihood of that happening and the likelihood of success if he does. as we watch some of these House members who are either aligned with him or not run for their first reelection.
And Dr. Ortega, I would just add to that you're also seeing, you saw some folks on the Democratic side, especially some progressives that joined the freshman class that have been particularly vocal, fairly early, or who have been high profile, several of whom kind of have expanded what we have come to know as the squad, the foursome that was elected in 2018, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, and Rashida Tlaib. So you have people like Cori Bush out of Missouri, who was a Ferguson activist who came out of the Black Lives Matter movement, first Black Lives Matter activist that was elected to Congress, as well as Mondaire Jones out of New York, actually a couple of people out of New York. So they are adding to the squad's roster and kind of continuing to push, trying to push the administration more towards the progressive goals that they have in mind. So it'll be interesting to see how they are able to impact policy as we go through 2021 and 2022. And then obviously also on the Senate side, you have the two Georgia Democratic senators who, nobody really saw coming. Georgia getting two Democratic senators, one, much less two. So Raphael Warnock, the first Black senator that Georgia has ever had, and then John Ossoff, the first Jewish American to represent Georgia. Both of them getting a lot of attention. Raphael Warnock already up for re-election next year because he was filling a seat, and so is already looking at Republican challengers who are seeking to reclaim that seat for the state.
All right, thank you very much, Sarah. I'm having a little trouble seeing the Q&A on my screen. Do you have any questions for us from your end?
Yes, Dr. Ortego, I sure do. And I encourage attendees to put questions into the Q&A versus the chat so that we can get them to Erin and Amanda. I also want to address, some of you have asked specific questions about AdPAC, which Amanda and Erin will not obviously be able to answer our internal questions about AdPAC. So we will be happy to follow up with you later on those questions, but please just address your questions to Amanda and Erin. So Amanda and Erin, first question is anonymous, and the question is, please explain the reconciliation loophole for passing legislation in the Senate. What long-range ramifications can we expect from use?
Yeah, okay. We did have a question about candidates such as Shirley Chisholm. So what do you think about the possibility of more candidates like her?
Well, I think that the Shirley Chisholm effect is looming very large, especially for Black women running for office. And that is, at all levels, state, federal, and everything in between. So next year is the 50th anniversary of Shirley Chisholm's pioneering run for president. She was the first Black woman to run for president on a major party ticket and to become a major party nominee as a Black woman. So, you see a lot of people. I mean, there's a Black woman, Jennifer McClellan, who's running for governor of Virginia, who is running in the spirit of Shirley Chisholm. When Vice President Kamala Harris launched her presidential bid in January of 2019, she did it in the spirit of Shirley Chisholm, had her colors, her campaign colors were a nod to Shirley Chisholm's 1972 campaign. You have so many Black women in Congress who speak about being inspired by Shirley Chisholm's political career. Congresswoman Barbara Lee out of California is somebody who got her start in politics working on Shirley Chisholm's presidential campaign. And so, I think you will hear a lot of women, especially women of color, speak very fondly about Shirley Chisholm as somebody who is a personal hero for them, somebody who's a source of inspiration just in terms of her kind of what they see as her bold and unapologetic leadership, and somebody who was really a pioneer who made a lot of their careers possible, but also showed them the path that made many of them want to enter into political office.
And I can take the reconciliation question that Sarah had started. I managed to multitask and pull it up here on my screen. So I will repeat the question and then answer it. It said, explain the reconciliation loophole for passing legislation in the Senate. What long-range ramification can we expect from the use of reconciliation, and where has it been used in the past? So reconciliation is a process that's always been around. It's just the lawmakers have started to use it differently kind of over the past 5 to 10 years, I would say. So essentially, it allows you to pass pieces of legislation that are related to the national budget. So it is, it has to have a budget impact. So that is why, for example, we wouldn't see them use reconciliation to pass voting rights legislation. We probably wouldn't see them use it to pass policing legislation. The big example that probably everyone remembers before this last coronavirus relief package that they used reconciliation for was the 2017 Republican tax overhaul. So that vote, they used the reconciliation process because raising and lowering taxes certainly has a budget impact. We saw them use that to pass taxes. It was obviously along party lines. I think the vote was at 1 a.m. if I remember correctly. So that was the last time we saw kind of a major piece of legislation move using reconciliation. Now, because it has all these rules related to it, you don't see it used that often. It's actually quite unusual that they're going to be able to use it a second time this Congress to pursue infrastructure, because, and I think the technicality is the coronavirus package was technically retroactive to last year for part of it. So, after they use it for infrastructure, assuming they move forward with that plan, we won't have reconciliation around for a while for them to use on these other pieces of legislation that they're trying to get passed.
Thank you. Next question. What is your advice for young women leaders in dentistry?
Well, I don't know much about dentistry other than I go to one.
Yes.
But I would say working for two women who, in the middle of a global pandemic, moved forward with a plan to try something different in an industry that they had been in for a while and kind of use their voices and use their perspectives as a strength to start something new. I think that would be my advice to women across a variety of fields, and that, it hasn't been until relatively recently that there has been representation, for women in a lot of professions, and our voices are still somewhat new in some of these fields. And, we can start to play a role by shaping them, by kind of finding our voices and moving forward. And I'm sure Erin has some thoughts to add.
Yeah, I mean, it's similarly to what Amanda's saying, representation matters. And I think that what I would say is no matter what field you are in, but in dentistry, I'm sure this is also the case, women of color are underrepresented in this country. And so, it matters that people in your community, people across our society see women in dentistry, see women as small business owners in this country, so that they understand that that is something that they can aspire to, so that the young women and young girls that are going to the dentist growing up see a woman when they sit down in that chair. Like, that means something, that expands their imagination about what is possible for their own lives, right? And so I would encourage you to lean into that lived experience, because you never know who's watching and who you may impact, not merely by the job that you are doing, but just the role that you embody, and the fact that you may come in a package that they may have not seen that role in before.
Thank you. That segues nicely into our next question from Michelle Reeder. Do you see the correlation in the push to encourage having women on corporate boards and the number of women participating in state and federal politics?
Yes, because I think that we're having an overall conversation in this country right now about women in power, right? It is not enough merely for women to be in the room. They need a seat at the table, and they also have to be able to use their voice at that table to influence the decision making and the policy making that is happening. And so, it is not enough to have a workforce, whether that workforce is in the private sector or in the public sector, where you can have a critical mass of women. Because again, I mean, at least before the pandemic, women were also the majority of the U.S. workforce, right? But that did not mean that women were being treated equitably in our society, because women were not the majority of decision makers. Same in journalism. I mean, we had to start this newsroom because the reality was that political journalism in particular had been too white and too male for too long. And so that means something when we talk about the types of stories that we are telling and who gets to tell those stories. It's the same for, corporate leadership. These boardrooms are often mostly white, mostly male. And so, to have a woman in the room certainly is something that women are saying is not acceptable, when we know that women are half the population, when we know that women are certainly many of the essential workers that kept this economy going, to be honest. And in Congress, you have certainly more women that have made up the most diverse Congress that we've ever had, but certainly not a representative body. And that also trickles down to when you talk about state houses, to all the way down to city councils and county governments.
And the good news is, I mean, the numbers are moving in the right direction, but we are still at 26.5% of Congress being women. I think that, the corporate boards that is happening because they are seeing that it makes good business sense to have diversity on boards. I think that we're seeing the same thing in politics, because I think the second half of that question had a political angle. For a while, and the reason we kind of saw the number of Republican women dwindle for a bit in Congress, in the House specifically, it was part of kind of an overall idea, this rejection of quote unquote identity politics. But I think that with the start of some of these PACs that supported Republican women, and the fact that some of them won, I think in districts where they were the best candidate for that race, for that district. So I think that we're seeing that it both makes business and political sense a lot of times to consider kind of who you're putting on your boards, who you're running as your candidates, and how your audience or your voters or your customers is going to respond to that.
Thank you. Before we get to our next question, there is a comment on here that says, Erin, I've seen you on MSNBC and have really enjoyed your appearances. And several people liked that comment. So I'm just passing that along to you.
Thank you.
Next question. Next question from Dr. Howard Warner. The 2020 election gave us an equally divided Senate and House, with the slimmest majority and a president campaigning on bipartisanship, yet there is very little evidence of any compromise. Why?
Well, I would say we are early. We're just 100 days in, not even. It's actually this Friday. So I do think we need to give them a little bit of time. Some, positive signs that we may see some bipartisanship, I would say, are on the Senate side. We've seen a lot of President Biden's nominees go through with significant Republican support. Not all of them, but some of them. And I think that's a sign of kind of a good faith effort to work together to allow a president to put together his cabinet. I mentioned earlier the anti-hate crime legislation that they passed last week. It's been a long time since I've covered a Senate vote that was 94-1. You just don't see that often. So, I think that for the time being has kind of quelled or put a damper on discussions that, on the Democratic side of, well, we need to change filibuster rules so we can pass everything with 50 votes, because they think that there might be a potential to start working together a little bit more. So, this bipartisanship, I would say, is definitely something that I'm watching really closely on the Senate side in particular, because as I explained earlier when we were talking about kind of reconciliation and that process, once they use that for infrastructure, they're done for a while. So in order to get anything else done over the next couple of years in Congress, the Senate is going to need to be able to come together and, pick up 9 or 10 Republican votes to get anything across the finish line. So I think there is potentially an opening for narrow bills related to gun safety, where the parties could come together. These are bills that have the support of the vast majority of Americans. These are bills that some Republicans have said that they support, but they just weren't brought up for a vote in prior Senates because then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell did not bring them up for a vote. Chuck Schumer has said that he will. So we'll see. We'll see. I do think it's early. I believe that people like to see their government working, and maybe as they do a couple small things and get them done with the parties working together, they'll be encouraged to do more. I think we'll have a much better idea kind of at the end of kind of the first year of the Biden administration in terms of what the possibilities might look like going forward.
I think Amanda's wearing her optimistic yellow over there. I have to add to this, Dr. Warner. I think part of the issue is also, frankly, the fallout from January 6th. The insurrection was very divisive, particularly along partisan lines. You still have, a significant number of Republicans who still subscribe to the idea that the election was rigged and that the results were erroneous. Or that the election was stolen. And that is something that Republicans in Congress are not disabusing Republicans in the country of. And so you're seeing that dynamic continue to play out in Congress. There's supposed to be a commission to investigate what happened with the insurrection. That is a very fraught process as well. But you see kind of that latent tension boiling over in hearings. I mean, just as recently as last week. So I don't know, kind of where Congress is in the healing process around the insurrection. I mean, we're still kind of coming to terms with exactly what happened there some, almost 5 months later. But that is something that certainly kind of looms over the governing that they are trying to do. And I think maybe having an impact on their ability to come together.
And before we move on to the next question, I love being an optimist. That's not something I get called often, having covered Washington for over a decade. But I do think there's a difference also, not just between the parties in terms of, how they're able to come to, there's a difference right now between the House and the Senate and how the lawmakers in each of those chambers are dealing with one another. I see far more potential for bipartisan compromise, perhaps in the Senate than in the House, just because of some of the internal dynamics of both of those parties, which Aaron just went into. And a lot of that, was, exacerbated by the insurrection. And there's just a lack of trust there, I think, especially on the House side. Between a lot of lawmakers, and I'm not sure how you can come together and work on bills if you don't have a kind of that base level of trust for the people you're working with.
Our next question maybe takes us a little bit further from Dr. Tom Shripsema. Are there any alignments of individual legislators that have potential for cooperative action that could push issues with broader interest?
Yes. Maybe. I was going to talk about Tim Scott and Cory Booker trying to work on police reform.
Yeah, you do that, and then I'll talk about another.
Yeah, because that certainly seems to be. I mean, if they are going to do anything on police reform, Tim Scott has been somebody as the lone Black Republican in the Senate. He is somebody who has talked about his personal experience with disparate policing, how he himself had been racially profiled, and so he understands. That something should be done to make policing more equitable, for Black Americans in this country. And so, that was something that he had tried to work on in the previous administration, was not successful in doing that. But now, there is a thought that there is maybe momentum to do something with the protests that you saw last summer, which were pretty diverse. And as an increasing number of Americans are open to the ideas that Black Lives Matter raises, particularly around, addressing community policing, especially in communities of color, that maybe the two of them and the Problem Solvers Caucus can try to hammer out something around policing that may not be perfect, certainly, and may not even be ideal, but at least would be something that gets beyond kind of the incremental changes around the edges that folks have been talking about doing in the past to really address a problem that many Americans see as systemic and institutional and entrenched.
And also on the Senate side, I mean, there's this group of lawmakers kind of in the middle at the edges of their parties. I mentioned Senators Manchin and Sinema earlier. They would be kind of the Democrats that are in that centrist group. On the Republican side, you have senators like Mitt Romney, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski. These are people who have already gone to the White House. These are senators that the Biden administration is talking to. Biden himself talked to a lot of these senators right after he was elected, before he was even inaugurated. So I do think, there is a desire. I think that the last 4 years really got people entrenched. I think it might take a little while for them to dig out. But those are kind of some of the other names I would be looking at as we move forward. I don't see them all getting together on massive things and singing Kumbaya, riding off into the sunset. But I do think that there's probably narrow pieces of larger issues that they can come together on. And kind of those are the names that I would be keeping an eye out for.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'll add to that is, politics is very motivating. Election years can be very motivating for people. So look at the senators who are up for re-election this year. Look at the senators who have decided that they're not going to run for re-election, right? I mean, they may not necessarily have an incentive to, cross over, to the other side of the aisle, but they may also, not be beholden to their party because they know that they are leaving office. And so those are also some of the folks who, may be movable, whereas, previously they may not have been.
Thank you, Dr. Ortego. I see you're back. Do you want to ask the next question?
Well, all I want to do is apologize for the technical issue. I kept trying to get back in, and I could see you all, but it never would. I couldn't speak anything. And so now, anyway, it looks like I'm back. But I wanted to thank the two of you so much for this great discussion, and apologize for the technical issue. But no, I did not have another question of my own. Sarah, did you have some more in the chat?
We do have just a few more, and we've got a few more minutes left. So next question is from Dr. Lissman. Do you see Congress materially addressing social determinants of healthcare, which account for approximately 80% of healthcare outcomes, as well as addressing the social inequities in healthcare?
That's a great question.
Well, I will say that healthcare just generally, while it's a very important issue for the Biden administration, it's not kind of on the list of the next 3 to 5 things they're going to be trying to get through Congress. So I think, your question has a lot of nuance to it, as do inequities in the healthcare system and just our healthcare system generally. So while I do think that is a priority for the administration, I don't think that's something that we're going to see addressed in a significant way in the first 6 months or so, at least, I would say. I also think, just getting the Affordable Care Act done was a really heavy lift for the Obama administration, Democrats then. Since then, you have seen some Republicans, several of them, our names I mentioned earlier, who have worked with Democrats to fix certain things in that. And those are the type of narrow fixes I think are a possibility in this Congress, but something really broad like that, because that would even be broader than the ACA in a way. I don't see that happening anytime soon. Now, there may be more things the administration is able to do through rulemaking or through executive orders, those type of things from the agencies. That's a possibility. But in terms of some massive healthcare plan getting through Congress, I don't see that happening in the near-term future.
Yeah, I think the action, to Amanda's point, is going to be driven by the administration. You had President Biden not long after taking office, issuing an executive order asking for all of the department heads across agencies to demonstrate, how they can be better addressing racial equity in, through their various departments, because the administration has said that tackling racial inequality is one of the 4 pillars that they felt like was a priority that they inherited upon taking office. And so that includes the Department of Health and Human Services, for example, but also the intersection of many different areas of American life that can have an impact on health that we know, right? Like areas like housing, areas like education, areas like labor, you know what I mean? So, showing how racial inequities are showing up in those different departments, collecting that data is an important step to trying to address how these things are related and how they need to be confronted from a policy perspective.
And the collection of data is a big one. That is something I think the administration can start to do on its own through the agencies. They don't need Congress to do some of that stuff. So, even just having the data to work with to move forward, to change things, would in and of itself be a change, I think, just starting to track some of that data.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. We're going to ask you just one more question. There's two questions, so we're going to sort of combine them into a two-part question because they are related.
Okay.
Is there a point at which passing something quickly or unilaterally is more important than chasing the specter of bipartisanship? And which issues do you foresee as having the highest possibilities for bipartisan support?
Mm-hmm.
Well, for the first part, I mean, that's a political decision. I think that the answer, for example, from the administration on coronavirus relief was it was more important to move fast and not worry about bipartisanship. I mean, they had initial discussions with a group of Democratic and Republican senators about that. Essentially, the senators presented their offer, and it was within 36 hours that the White House announced their plan. So there wasn't much back and forth there. It was kind of like, we'll hear you out on this, but here's our plan. And the rationale for that was, this is so important and so delayed, we need to move fast. So I think that's a political calculation. I think that for long-term things, like we saw with the Affordable Care Act, I think if you can get bipartisan support when you're trying to dramatically change the system, it's important because it gives it longevity, it gives it staying power. It's not something that's going to vacillate back and forth between administrations or Congresses. So I guess I handled the first part of that question. If you want to take the second, Erin, or add anything to what I've already said.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right on the pandemic relief package. Because that was a priority for the administration. There was an attempt to bring bipartisan members of Congress to the table so that they could say that they made a good faith effort to have that input before they move forward, because they knew that they could. It seems to be the same playbook that they're using around infrastructure at this point. So I would not be surprised if that's the same process. They're also redefining what bipartisanship means, right? They're not just limiting that to members of Congress. They are touting, to the extent that they can, support that they're getting from Republican governors, from Republican mayors across the country, right? Who are saying that these plans are a good idea. They're touting polls that show that, a majority of Republicans support certain ideas that they are pushing and trying to get passed into law. So they are attempting, I think, to have a kind of a broader conversation about bipartisanship that kind of bolsters their sense of urgency around certain policy that they have decided is a priority. Now, other things, I think they know are maybe going to take a little bit longer. Things like the minimum wage, for example, things like immigration. They know those things aren't going to happen right away. It's not that they aren't ready to bring them up in the conversation, but they know that that's the beginning of a longer conversation around those kinds of things that have been, frankly, intractable preceding this administration, preceding several administrations. And so, kind of getting to a point where they have a resolution on that. I mean, minimum wage is something that the president has said he wants to see happen by the end of the year, but we don't know if that's going to happen or not, but he knows that he knew that it wasn't going to happen right away, right? That it wasn't going to happen in that American Rescue package. Immigration was brought up, but it was clear that legislation was not really ready for prime time. And so I guess they're back to the drawing board on that as well. But I think you're going to continue to see, Joe Biden being a creature of the Senate for half a century, just about, is somebody who is inclined to try to work with others to get things done. But, if that can't happen, what he has said is that failure is not an option, and that they're going to move forward with the American people.
Well, thank you both so much for your participation today. It was really enjoyable and interesting. And I apologize again for the technical issue. But I want to thank you again and thank all of you, all 303 of you, for being here with us this afternoon. Yeah. And so now we're going to throw it back to Mike Graham at Tooth Party Studios, live and in color.
Thank you, Dr. Ortego. That was a great session. And thank all of you for being with us today. I know it's been a long day, but I have some specific information about what is next, so please listen carefully. Your strategy session allows you to get together with your entire state to share schedules, add people to meetings, and such. During this session, you should decide who is attending which meeting and who is presenting which issues. If you are not participating in your Hill meetings, you do not need to attend the strategy session. We also know some states have scheduled their strategy session for a different time. If you fall into either of those categories, you're free to enjoy your evening, and we thank you so much for your time today. For those of you with 6 attendees or fewer, please stay on the Remo platform and find your table. These states, and I'll go slowly, these states include Alaska, Alabama, Arkansas, DC, Delaware, Georgia, Hawaii, Iowa, Idaho, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, Montana, Nebraska, New Hampshire, New Mexico, Oregon, South Dakota, Tennessee, Utah, and Vermont. For those of you with larger states, your state should have set up a platform for your strategy session. So you will leave the Remo platform and log in per the instructions of your state. Our staff will be on the main floor at the ADPAC, ASDA, Ask the Lobbyist, and ADA members services tables. We'll be in touch with further instructions, materials, and resources as you prepare for your Hill meetings. But I want to thank you again for being with us today, and good luck this week. Thank you so much for participating in this event. Have a great evening. Thank you.